very grateful for Heather. She's going to be bringing us the Spirit's identity and the nature of communications. And so please join us in welcoming Heather.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you as well to the Federation and to this Spiritist Center for having me here. It's really a great pleasure to share this day with you all. And I'd like to start off this afternoon with a question, and I do want your feedback. And the question is, why do we need to know about the nature of spirit communications and the identity of spirits? Why is that important? Anyone have any idea?
Credibility.
Okay. No other brave souls yet today. That's okay. I'm not going to jump in right away and just give out the answers. The question was really just to get our ideas flowing after lunch. And I'd like instead for us to start with an imagination exercise. So I want you to imagine that you're going to do an online search for some information. And regardless of the topic or your particular reason for wanting this information, let's suppose that it is very important to you. And I want you to imagine that you're given the magical ability to read at superhuman speeds, because you will read, let's say, the first 200 text-based results that come up. And one more detail, you will not know anything about the author of each of the texts that you find. Now keep in mind that, as we all know, anyone and everyone can post things on the internet, right? From those with the best of intentions to those with the worst. The experts to the downright ignorant, the well-informed and knowledgeable to the misinformed, and even just merely opinionated. So what are you going to do with all of this information that comes up? How are you going to decide what is reliable, persuasive, and useful? Anyone have any ideas how you might approach the task of weeding through all of this information?
The source.
Sources? Any other ideas?
Quality.
The quality? Exactly. Okay, so those are a couple of good ideas, and they are very much in line with the list that I put together. So let's take a look. Of course, probably one of the first things that you're going to start doing is you will compare each of the texts to one another. I'm sorry, to what you already know, if you already have any knowledge on this topic. Something else that you will do is look at the language and the tone of the writing. Now, the language might give you some impression of the level of education that this author has, maybe in general, but probably on the specific topic. And the tone could give you some idea of his or her personal character. And think about it. Someone might have great ideas, but if the expression of them is somehow crude, offensive, or maybe just poorly structured, it can be hard to take interest in that and see past it. Something else you'll look at is the flow of ideas, the reasoning and soundness of all the arguments. In other words, we want to look for logic. And likewise, we look for consistency. This means that the author is not contradicting him or herself at different points in the text. And, as was mentioned, you're going to look for the sources that may be cited, if any. What kind of sources of those? Where is that coming from? And then you will compare each of these texts with one another. This is something that we naturally do as we're doing research. We start putting everything together to see how they compare. And when we find broad points of agreement, these are more likely to be evidence of reliability. They also set aside the points of disparity to which we can then give further analysis if we're interested in learning more and going deeper. Now, if you were able to know, not necessarily the specific author of the text, but who brought it to you, meaning who published that information, would you also give some credit to that and take that into consideration? Of course you would, right? This situation that we have here is not too unlike that which we face when communicating with the inhabitants of the spiritual world. The mediums in this case are somewhat like the publishers, and the spirits that are communicating with us are simply human spirits. They are the souls of those once living on earth or in other worlds who are now free from the flesh. Together with these spirits, we form a community of human spirits where at any given time, some of us are living here temporarily in the physical world, like you and I, while the others, in fact the majority, are living in the spiritual world. Now, to talk about the nature of spirit communications, we need to talk first about the nature of the spirits themselves. And in this context, I refer to the diversity found among the spirits. This really isn't hard because all we need to do is look around and observe the people that we interact with every day, and add to that the ones that we read about or hear about in some other way. Now, as I said, the discarnate spirits, they're just like us. So they have diverse cultural influences, intellectual aptitudes, moral tendencies, and even personal interests. And the point here is that this insight is the key to understanding the nature of spirit communications, and even in part the identity of the spirits themselves. Now, in introducing 4 general categories of the communications, which I will show you in a moment, Kardec writes, if we have fully understood the infinite variety of spirits as to their intelligence and morality according to the spirit hierarchy, so here we have this general outline that we refer to as the spirit hierarchy. It's found in the Spirit's book. We will easily comprehend the differences in their communications. The communications must necessarily reflect the nobility or baseness of their ideas, their wisdom or ignorance, and their vices or virtues. So no matter who the medium is, the fact that the information comes from the spiritual realm does not mean that it is necessarily true or useful. And this process that we talked about for evaluating information from an unknown source in the material world reflects a lot of what Kardec did in his approach to scrutinizing the spirit communications from which he eventually derived the principles of Spiritism. And guess what? It reflects a lot of what we must also do when analyzing communications from the spiritual realm. But we now have the advantage of benefiting from all the instruction and the advice that Kardec shared in this regard. And by the way, though we may now be accustomed to reading about advanced or morally superior spirits, inferior spirits, and spirits in between, as spiritists, it is important for us to read about the history behind the development of this knowledge in order to know why we trust in Kardec and his work, and why we believe what we do about the moral principles of Spiritism. Okay, so in the Medium's book, Allan Kardec presents 4 categories for the classification of spirit communications. So we're going to take a look at those now. First, we have crude communications, and these come from spirits of the lowest order. They deliver shocking and repulsive expressions that Kardec says are no different from those used by crude human beings among us. We are unfortunately familiar with this type of character, right? Then we have frivolous communications, which come from cunning and mischievous spirits who are not downright evil, but do like to have fun at our expense, using every opportunity they can find to meddle in spirit communications. They give little importance to truth, and they take pleasure in things like mockery, useless conversations, and the befuddlement of the gullible. Kardec says they sometimes let loose with witty and biting tirades, often mixing banal jokes with hard truths. And we're familiar with this kind of character as well. As you can imagine, there are people who find the immaturity and the impish nature of such communications to be entertaining. But in Spiritism, we learn that this is really a dangerous form of amusement because it naturally opens the door to deception. The next category is referred to as serious communications, referring to both subject and form. And it encompasses any communication of a useful purpose that is absent of frivolousness or crudeness. So here, Kardec cautions that seriousness does not imply accuracy. And this is because many communications come from spirits who mean well, but they simply don't know what they're talking about. And Kardec warns about what he calls the pseudo-scholar spirits, who talk with great pride and conviction, regardless of whether they're right or wrong, and they have no scruples about borrowing venerated names. So you should also know that intelligence does not imply moral superiority. And I think that even with people, our experience, maybe way too much of it, tells us that this is true. Now, we still have yet another category, and thankfully, because in Spiritism, we seek truth and knowledge from reliable sources who offer communications favorable to our spiritual nourishment and growth. So, in pursuit of that objective, we seek what are called instructive communications. Kardec describes these as serious communications whose main purpose is to provide teachings from the spirits regarding the sciences, morality, philosophy, etc. And their greater or lesser profoundness depends on the particular level of advancement of that individual spirit that's communicating. So looking at these four general classifications, then these things here are all very important for assessing the type of spirit communication that has been received. And as a spiritist named Eliseo Regonati wrote, to analyze a spirit communication is to study it word for word, line by line, and passage by passage, and then to later accept it, reject it, or set it aside for further observation. And he comments that in particular we would set it aside when it brings new information that we cannot confirm yet. Now, to do all that, we also need to be humble, to study the communications from an unbiased and impartial perspective. Also, if we are not ourselves the medium, then we do need to take into consideration who is transmitting to us the Spirit's message. Now I have another question. If there are some cunning spirits out there willing to deceive us, couldn't they just trick us by saying wonderful things and decorating their communications with pleasant or impressive language and then gradually lead us astray? And the truth is, yes, of course, these spirits can pretend to be what they are not, and they do try. So what can we do? Well, we can be attentive, humble, and patient while we do our best to practice good judgment. Keeping in mind another instruction from Kardec, where he writes that it is only through the regularity and frequency of the communications that we can appraise the moral and intellectual value of the spirits who are communicating with us, as well as the degree of trust that they deserve. And then regarding these spirits who are more pretentious than wise, he says that with time, they soon expose their weak side by showing little continuity in their communications or by our challenging of their statements. So they will always reveal their true nature. When we proceed in this way, we can, with proper study, weed out those communications that are frivolous or even harmful, and then we can look at the more serious ones in search of valuable knowledge, consolation, and even inspiration. This is the beauty of mediumship. But what about the identity of those spirits themselves? In the Medium's book, Kardec's chapter on the identity of spirits involves two aspects of this subject, which are here. And regarding the nature and classification of the spirits, which we've already touched on a little bit, again, we rely on our knowledge regarding the human attributes of those spirits and the diversity found among them, our awareness of the need for caution, and our attention to the language and tone, as well as the logic of the communications, which are, as I had mentioned, the means by which the spirits will always reveal their true colors, so to speak. In spite of their great diversity, for general discussion, we can talk about the spirits in terms of two general categories. And these are the good or superior spirits and the inferior or lower order spirits. Kardec presents us with several points to guide us in our ability to distinguish between them. And I would just like to point out that on the Explore Spiritism website, you can find a table that represents a comparative summary of these points. Don't try to read it now. As well as a lot of information concerning several topics about mediumship. I just wanted to point out that it's there for future reference. But basically, the good and superior spirits will consistently deliver communications that reflect their advanced moral virtues and their objective of truly contributing toward our progress. So they're always kind-hearted and compassionate, using language that is simple, dignified, and clear. They humbly and wisely communicate only about what they know and of what is appropriate for us to hear from them. Their statements are always in accordance with reason and the laws of nature, and they never give commands. They only give us advice, which will always point us to compassion. These spirits will not flatter the medium or anyone else present. So on the flip side, that is a big red flag, okay? And they're not bothered by our scrutiny. In fact, they encourage us to question everything and look into it as much as we want to. If their presence makes a physical impression on the medium or anyone else present, this will be a pleasant one, simply reflecting their calm and gentle quality. Now, on the other hand, we have the inferior or lower order spirits. These spirits can be cunning, vulgar, arrogant, rude, mean, you name it, among the ways in which they reveal inferior human passions. They will speak boldly about anything with little regard for truth or appropriateness, and then they just try to cover their ignorance with pretentiousness and obscurity. They don't use logic or speak in agreement with natural laws, and yet they demand blind credence. They love to give bad advice, stir things up, and create disharmony, and their physical impression, if any, will most likely be unpleasant, if not worse. As promised, we have yet another aspect of spirit identity to talk about, and that is the name of the communicating spirit. Now, because of our own fixation with names and the importance that we give to them, based on this and the fact that we really cannot have any absolute proof about the name, Kardec says that this issue is one of the greatest difficulties of practical Spiritism. There's a well-known Spiritist medium that I think many of you know of. Her name is Sueli Caldas Schubert, and she offers some reasons as to why this is so complicated. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, let's just assume that the medium in particular, the medium involved, is actually a medium and not a charlatan, just as our starting point. In some cases, a medium who is not careful may unwillingly but erroneously capture the wrong name out of a deep desire to receive communications from some entity that he or she particularly admires. Likewise, a medium lacking in proper mediumistic education, or one who simply fails to take guard against his or her own pride, may be convinced that the communicator is a well-known and highly respected spiritual benefactor or some other famous personality, when in reality, it is only an ordinary and dishonest spirit. Other times, mistakes are made when we are influenced by some kind of event. So, for example, people often wish to receive a communication from a departed loved one, and this can and does happen. However, sadly, Sueli says, there are innumerable situations in which these people may seek the help of a medium, and especially when they insist on receiving the communication, that they're only finding themselves deceived by a spirit who merely pretends to be that loved one and who may even say things that are not true. So, unfortunately, we cannot have absolute proof. We can only seek proof beyond reasonable doubt, kind of like in court, right? And so, as Kardec says, it is easier to confirm the identity with those of our day, those known to us. In this case, the evidence of identity may include language, use of words, recollection of specific events, especially those little known to others, and other personal peculiarities, as well as many little corroborating circumstances and indications that present themselves gradually over time. Now, when receiving communications from those who claim to be individuals of ancient times, the proofs of identification can be much more difficult, and in some cases, even impossible. So Kardec says we are then reduced to an appreciation based on moral and intellectual considerations, judging of the spirits as we judge of men, by their thoughts and their language. So what about this communications purported to come from superior spirits or honored individuals. Well, Kardec says that when a superior spirit communicates under any well-known name and says nothing inconsistent with the elevated character of that individual, the presumption is considered in favor of the identity claimed. In the very least, he says, we may be sure that it is a spirit of the same degree, which coincidentally makes the name even less important. What we're most interested in is this very indication of the place that the spirit occupies in that spirit hierarchy. And ultimately, it's not the individual that we're most interested in, but what we can learn from the communication. Now, Kardec adds something else that is interesting. He says, the superior spirits explain that spirits of a high degree form a collective whole whose individual members, with few exceptions, are relatively unknown to us. And remember, those who we know are the few who have actually incarnated here on earth among us. So when needed and without any practical inconvenience for us, these superior spirits can substitute themselves for one another, which only makes sense. But this is a totally different case from the spirits of a lower order who borrow the venerated names only to gain a false credibility. And as we mentioned before, they will eventually reveal their true character. In the Medium's book, you will find more detail on all of this, including a whole set of questions and answers. So I really encourage you to take a look at it. Well, when you leave here today, I ask that you remember some advice from Kardec. He says that common sense is the sole criterion by which we ascertain the quality of spirits and the value of their communications. That spirits are to be judged by their language and actions, the sentiments they inspire, and the counsels that they give, and that while carefully scrutinizing the style of spirit communications, we must also examine their meaning, weighing their statements coolly, patiently, and without prejudice. And to offer one last piece of food for thought, never failing to emphasize the importance of humbleness and self-awareness in all we do, Kardec also reminds us that in order to judge both spirits and individuals, we must first know how to judge ourselves. Thank you so much for your attention, and have a great afternoon.